Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into the story of Cary Stayner.
Okay.
Now, his name might sound familiar because of his connection to a famous kidnapping case, but his own actions took some really dark turns. To understand it all,
Mm.
we've gathered legal documents,
Mhm.
news reports, and even some in-depth psychological analysis. Buckle up.
What makes this case particularly fascinating is that it's not a simple story. It
Yeah.
really forces us to consider the complex nature of human behavior,
Mm.
how trauma can echo through generations, and the constant struggle to understand what drives a person to such horrific acts.
So to really dive in, we need to start with Carrie's younger brother,
Okay.
Steven Stayner. He was kidnapped at just 7 years old and held captive for an unimaginable 7 years. This case captivated the country, especially with the book and miniseries I Know My First Name is Steven shining a light on it.
That's right. And while it might seem natural to draw a direct line from Stephen's kidnapping to Cary's later crimes, it's essential to acknowledge that Cary claimed his own disturbing fantasies actually began,
Yeah.
even before his brother's abduction.
Wow. That adds such a disturbing layer to this whole thing, but I can't help but wonder about the psychological impact that Steven's return and the media frenzy
Mm,
surrounding it must have had on Carrie.
sure.
To have your family go through that kind of trauma, then seemingly be pushed aside when your brother returns, it's hard to fathom.
You're touching on something crucial here. There were reports suggesting that Cary felt neglected, as his parents understandably were
Mm.
consumed with grief, and then focused on Stephen's reintegration. When Stephen came back, the spotlight shone intensely on him. And it's not a stretch to think that intensified any feelings of being overlooked that Cary might have already harbored.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this could potentially set the stage for a need for attention, even if that attention ends up being negative.
Exactly. And that brings us to Cary's early life, where we start to see some troubling signs. At the age of 3, he was diagnosed with trichotillomania, a condition that causes compulsive hair pulling. Imagine a young child struggling with that.
Wow.
The noticeable bald spots and the potential for bullying.
It's heartbreaking to think about how that must have affected his self-image, especially at such a vulnerable age. He was basically set up for a difficult social experience.
You're right. And he did face severe bullying. However, there's this contrasting element to his childhood as well. He was also considered intelligent and creative.
Hmm.
Reports indicate he was placed in accelerated classes and even received recognition as the most creative student in his graduating class.
So you have this complex picture emerging.
Yeah.
A bright, creative child struggling with a disorder and enduring relentless bullying. It makes you wonder how those experiences might have shaped his development.
Absolutely. It's never a single factor that defines a person's path. And to further complicate things, there's also the incident where he exposed himself to a friend of his sister. This adds another layer of concern to his early behavior.
So even in his youth, there were red flags. And sadly, things don't exactly smooth out as he enters adulthood, do they?
Unfortunately, no. His early adulthood was marked by a suicide attempt, a stay in a mental institution,
Mm.
and even a drug arrest. All of these events offer a glimpse into the inner turmoil he was experiencing.
While none of this excuses what he would eventually do, I can see how these experiences offer some crucial context for understanding his psychological state leading up to his crimes.
That's precisely it. It's not about excusing behavior, but understanding the multifaceted factors that might contribute to the complexity of the human psyche.
Okay, so this leads us to 1999 when Cary was working as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel near Yosemite National Park. This is where the Yosemite murders take place. Could you walk us through what happened?
Certainly, between February and July of that year,
Yeah.
Cary murdered 4 people. Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter, Julie Sund, 16-year-old Sylvina Palazzo, and Joy Ruth Armstrong. The details of each murder are incredibly disturbing.
I've read accounts of how Carol and Sylvina's bodies were found in the trunk of Carol's burned-out rental car. To imagine the horror of that discovery and then needing dental records just to identify them due to the severity of the burns?
It was truly horrific. And adding to the terror, a week later, a handwritten note with a map leading to Julie's body was sent to the police. It's almost like he was deliberately escalating the fear and tension
Yeah.
surrounding the case.
I'm curious about that note. What does something like that deliberate act of communication, tell us about his psychological state at that point? Was it a cry for attention, a twisted power play?
It's certainly a chilling detail that raises a lot of questions. Some experts suggest that this type of communication, particularly the map leading to Julie's body, could indicate a need for control, a desire to manipulate the investigation. It's difficult to say definitively, but it definitely adds a psychological dimension that we need to consider.
Absolutely. Then just a few months later, Joy Ruth Armstrong was found murdered as well.
Yes, and the details of her murder are particularly brutal. She had been decapitated, and witnesses reported seeing a blue International Scout parked outside her cabin. That vehicle was later traced back to Cary Stayner.
So that's what ultimately led to his arrest.
Correct. FBI agents apprehended him at a nudist resort. And during questioning, he confessed to all 4 murders.
Wait, he confessed without any attempt to deny or downplay his actions?
Yes, and his vehicle contained evidence directly linking him to Joy Ruth Armstrong. The confession itself is particularly interesting, as it raises questions about his motivation for confessing so readily. Was it a genuine desire to unburden himself, or was there something else at play?
It's almost like he wanted to be caught, or maybe even crave the notoriety that would come with confessing to such heinous crimes.
That's a very astute observation, and is a point worth exploring further, but before we go down that path, there's another layer to this case that adds even more complexity. There are several other unsolved cases that bear a striking resemblance to his known crimes, and some believe his killing spree might have begun much earlier than 1999.
Hold on, you're saying there's a possibility of even more victims out there?
The thought is chilling, but it's a very real possibility. In exploring those unsolved cases and the evidence that potentially links them to Cary Stayner might offer even deeper insights into his motivations and psyche. Host. Let's delve into those suspected crimes.
Okay.
One that immediately comes to mind is the case of Patricia Marie Hicks Dahlstrom, who disappeared back in 1982.
1982, that's almost 2 decades before the Yosemite murders. If there's a connection there, that significantly changes the timeline of his potential criminal activity.
Exactly. Patricia was last seen traveling to Yosemite, and tragically, a severed arm and hand were discovered in the park. It wasn't until 2021, using advanced genetic genealogy, that those remains were finally identified as hers.
Wow, that must have been a major breakthrough for investigators after all those years. But what specifically connects her disappearance to Cary Stayner?
Well, there's a connection to a rather disturbing element. Patricia was a member of a cult, led by Donald Gibson, a man later convicted of sex offenses.
Okay.
Cary Stayner actually attended Gibson's trial, and some authorities believe he might have targeted Patricia as a twisted form of retaliation for her testimony against the cult leader.
So we're potentially looking at a motive driven by a distorted sense of loyalty or revenge. That adds a whole new layer to his psychological profile.
It does, and it illustrates just how deep and complex his criminal history might actually be. It's a chilling thought. But we need to consider the possibility that this wasn't simply about random acts of violence, but potentially calculated and targeted attacks.
It's hard to wrap your head around that level of premeditation, especially considering his later crimes seem more opportunistic.
Yeah.
Were there any other potential links to Stayner in these unsolved cases?
Yes. There's the unsolved murder of Stayner's own uncle, Jesse Stayner, in 1990.
Okay.
Cary was living with his uncle at the time, and he later alleged that Jesse had molested him.
So we have another potential victim with a direct personal connection to Stayner, and one that involves allegations of abuse within his own family.
It's incredibly disturbing,
Oh.
and it raises questions about whether this alleged abuse might have been a contributing factor to his violent tendencies, perhaps even driving him to seek some form of twisted revenge.
It's certainly a possibility, though, as you mentioned earlier. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions without concrete evidence. It's easy to get caught up in the speculation, especially with a case this complex. But what other unsolved cases are on the radar beyond these direct personal connections?
There's the case of Sherilyn Mavon Murphy, whose body was found in 1994. The details are incredibly disturbing. She was found headless and handless. The brutality of her murder and the fact that she was discovered in a remote area bear striking resemblance to the killing of Joy Ruth Armstrong.
That specific detail, the decapitation, is incredibly chilling. It's not just about the violence itself, but the method, the almost ritualistic nature of it.
Exactly. And that similarity, combined with the fact that both victims were found in relatively isolated locations, has led investigators to consider a strong possibility of a connection to Stayner.
It's like a horrifying pattern is emerging, one that goes beyond random acts of violence and suggests a more deliberate and calculated approach.
That's a very insightful observation. And then we had the disappearance of Michael Larry Madden in 1996. He vanished while on a camping trip, and despite extensive searches, no trace of him was ever found.
Okay.
While there's no direct evidence linking Stayner to this case, The timing and circumstances have led investigators to consider him as a potential suspect.
So we have a young man who disappeared without a trace in an area where Stayner was known to be active. It's difficult to ignore that kind of coincidence, especially given the other potential connections we've discussed.
Right, and the lack of any other leads or explanations in Madden's disappearance makes Stayner's potential involvement even more unsettling. It raises the question of whether there are even more victims out there, cases that have yet to be connected to him.
It's a truly chilling thought, but one we have to consider. This cloud of suspicion hangs over him, extending far beyond the convictions for the Yosemite murders.
Absolutely. It leaves us grappling with the horrifying possibility that the full extent of Cary Stayner's crimes may never be fully known. But for now, let's shift gears and talk about the trials and convictions for the Yosemite murders.
Okay.
What happened in the courtroom?
From what I understand, he was actually tried separately for the murder of Joy Ruth Armstrong, the one that took place on federal land. What was the outcome of that trial?
You're correct.
Yeah.
In that case, he opted to plead guilty. A strategic move likely aimed at avoiding a potential death sentence. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So at least for that particular case, there was a sense of justice served. But what about the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina? How did those trials unfold?
For those murders,
Yeah.
which fell under state jurisdiction, he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
That's a bold defense strategy. What was the basis of his insanity plea?
His legal team presented evidence of a long history of mental illness and sexual abuse within his family, arguing that these factors significantly contributed to his actions. They highlighted his trichotillomania, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and even went so far as to request child pornography be admitted as evidence as part of a plea deal.
That's a shocking detail. What was the reasoning behind that particular request?
They were attempting to build a case that Stayner's actions were driven by uncontrollable urges, rooted in deep-seated psychological trauma. The request for child pornography was likely intended to shock the jury and bolster their argument about his mental state.
It's a risky strategy, to say the least. Did the jury ultimately accept the insanity plea?
No. Despite the evidence presented and the testimony of experts, the jury rejected the insanity defense. He was ultimately found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and kidnapping and received a death sentence.
It seems that even with the evidence of his troubled past, the horrific nature of his crimes outweighed any mitigating factors in the eyes of the jury. They held him fully accountable for his actions.
Yes. And it speaks to the immense challenge of using mental illness as a defense in such brutal and calculated crimes. The legal system constantly grapples with the delicate balance of recognizing the impact of mental health while ensuring justice for the victims and their families. But before we delve into the implications of that, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more on the Cary Stayner case. So where does this leave Cary Stayner today?
He's been on death row at San Quentin State Prison since 2002. However, executions in California are currently on hold due to ongoing legal challenges to the state's death penalty protocol.
So it sounds like he's in a kind of legal limbo, awaiting a fate that may never actually come.
That's a very accurate way to put it. It adds yet another layer of complexity to this already intricate and deeply disturbing case.
Yeah. We've uncovered a life marked by tragedy, overshadowed by his brother's infamous kidnapping, and ultimately defined by a descent into darkness. What I find particularly striking is the fact that Stayner was, by many accounts, intelligent and creative. He was even voted most creative in his high school class. It's a chilling reminder that darkness can dwell even in seemingly bright minds.
That's an important point. It challenges our preconceived notions about who's capable of such acts. Evil isn't always easy to spot.
Right.
Sometimes it hides behind a facade of normalcy.
Even talent. It makes you wonder about the unseen struggles people might be facing, the potential for darkness to fester beneath the surface.
Indeed. And as we conclude this deep dive, it's crucial to remember the victims and their families. Their lives were irrevocably altered by Stayner's actions, and their pain and loss deserve our empathy and respect. While we focused on Stayner's story today, it's their stories that truly matter.
Absolutely. Their experiences, their loss, should never be forgotten. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of the Cary Stayner case. It's a story that forces us to confront the complexities of human nature, the enduring impact of trauma, and the unsettling truth that sometimes, even in the face of extensive investigation and analysis, some questions may remain unanswered.
Absolutely.